Vintage watches tend to be a real Marmite topic on the channel. Some people vehemently advise against them, feeling that far too many are poorly maintained and when you factor in servicing do not offer good value for money or accurate timekeeping. Others feel very passionately that they are more interesting, attractive and attainable than modern pieces, with a common theme being that a vintage Swiss piece is a better use of your time and money than a Far Eastern budget alternative. For me personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. I've had some great experiences with vintage pieces and some awful ones, and it comes down to shopping carefully in the first place. To that end, this video is going to focus on watches I would recommend looking into if you're after a vintage watch. I followed a series of rules to try and guide my choices, and the first of these, that the watch must of course be vintage. Technically speaking, that means it needs to be between 20 and 99 years old, as anything beyond that would be considered an antique. Secondly, the pieces must be available at the time of writing for less than $1,000. Obviously, we're not dealing with a recommended retail price here, so I'm just going to be quoting the lowest price for a piece that I can find that I would personally consider purchasing. You'll note that, unlike most of my other list videos, the prices quoted have a plus after them to indicate that this is what I would consider the bottom of the price range to shop at. Finally, for the sake of variety, each brand can only feature once on the list. And with all that said, let's get into the video. While not a huge name in the West, HMT was a big deal in India. I find the brand fascinating because it was in operation for over half a decade, produced north of 100 million wristwatches, and despite being a fan of horology, until last year I personally had never even heard of them. What I uncovered was an absolute treasure trove, and because the watches were inexpensive to begin with and so plentiful, you can still find new old stock at extremely low prices for pieces that still qualify as vintage. Not exactly Swiss brand prestige, I grant you, but really interesting. I will quickly say, don't read too much into the imagery here. The piece that I have costs nowhere near the price quoted. I bought it out of curiosity, largely because of the aesthetics of the piece and simply not knowing that RICOH used to make watches. Now the appeal here is exactly that unconventional design. Sure, you can buy some really classy vintage dress pieces, but design oddities are another equally valid avenue. The simple fact is you'll struggle to find any modern watches that look like this, so if it's a design language you like, vintage is the way to go. CREDOR are a really interesting sub-brand of Seiko. Traditionally, the branding has been used alongside the Seiko logo to denote a series of luxury formal dress pieces. They are luxury looking for sure, but certainly not luxury pricing, and often feature quartz movements to keep the pieces thin and the prices down. In recent years, while still run by Seiko, that branding has been dropped, and the watches released a few but expensive. An example of this is the HE2, which trades for 5 figures. Effectively, when buying vintage, you're getting what has been transformed into a premium brand, but at a budget price. Be aware though, these are very small watches by modern standards. As I mentioned with the RICOH, one big appeal for me with vintage pieces is that there are some really interesting designs and oddities out there. During the quartz crisis, Swiss brands tried a lot of different things to compete. While you've likely heard of how the biggest brands survived by turning to Genta-designed or Genta-inspired sports pieces, there are examples of less successful attempts to compete with quartz that are nevertheless very interesting. The BF 1582 is one such example. It's a piece with digital written on the dial, and indeed the display revolves around the display of digits, but the watch itself is entirely mechanical. VERTEX is a member of the Dirty Dozen, a group of watchmakers commissioned by the British military to produce watches for the armed forces during World War II. They are a part British, part Swiss brand, boasting Swiss made on the dial. For me, this is a special piece as it's the watch that my grandfather wore. I've got a video that will come out on the channel soon going over it in detail, but I think the vintage looks really speak for themselves. Obviously the model I'm showing in this footage is my grandfather's, but it is worth knowing that you can pick up pieces in considerably better condition than this. This was the watch that first really got me into watch collecting and horology as a hobby. It taught me a number of things on a personal level. It's through my research into the piece that I initially learned how mechanical and automatic movements work. I learned how accuracy is measured, why Swiss made is valued, and it's also what started me on my personal preference for smaller watches. The thing is, the Seamaster and indeed the Constellation and Geneve ranges have such a huge back catalogue, I'd be very surprised if there isn't a vintage Omega model out there that you fall in love with. As an aside, you'll find so many classic dress style pieces from so many different Swiss manufacturers when you start looking at vintage pieces under $1,000. There are a lot that I could recommend, but I've tried to make the list a lot wider in scope. So think of the Seamaster also as me ticking that box, as vintage Swiss dress watches could easily become its own list. I think it's worth saying that in general, I have avoided watches with much in the way of complications, as it's just something else to go wrong, and some older, less common movements are going to be more difficult to service as and when needed. I had to include at least one on the list though, and continuing on my theme of selecting models for their unique design aesthetics, I picked out the HEMA Yachting Chronograph, a Swiss-made Valjoux 7733 powered chronograph piece with a subtle but interesting use of colour across its subdials. This model was initially released back in 1993, and while they were sold in the West, a lot of the models you'll find advertised are from Japan. That would bump up the cost because of import tax, but still come in under $1,000. While I featured a specific watch here, the reason I want to feature a Grand Seiko is they have the best build quality of any brand you can buy in this price range, at least in my opinion. So if you want a vintage piece with some certainty that it will be fully functional, any quartz piece with a Grand Seiko logo on the front of it is about as safe as it's going to get. It is possible to pick up a Cartier tank below $1,000, particularly if it bears the Mr. Cartier branding rather than just Cartier on the dial. I will be clear though, this is only just about possible, and I would shop very carefully at this price point. The reason I feel comfortable including this as a suggestion is that for less than $1,000, if there are no viable Cartier pieces available when you go to look, you can still pick up almost any version of the Seiko tank for comfortably under budget. And also my personal alternative pick, the Universal Geneve 542139, which is a really beautiful piece. Continuing from that previous point, coming in just under the budget cap as my official pick for the list from Universal Geneve, I'd be looking to pick up a POLEROUTER. This is a watch with a really huge price range, realistically starting around $600, but at just below the $1,000 mark, I found some micro rotor pieces in amazing condition, though it is worth knowing that rarer, older models go for a lot more. The reason for this is quite simple. The original launch was designed by Gerald Genter in 1954, so really it's a piece of horological history. So there we have it, what I consider to be the 10 best vintage watches money can buy for less than $1,000. This proved to be a very challenging list because there is simply such a huge variety to pick from. There is absolutely no way we could ever reach a consensus about a list like this, and two people could have markedly different experiences with very similar models, simply because of the age of the pieces and their individual histories. One thing we definitely can do is discuss my choices. In particular though, I would love to hear other suggestions from you, especially if they come from less prominent brands. Let's discuss in the comments section below. As a final aside, I would just like to add a word of caution. If a deal looks too good to be true, approach it with extreme caution and skepticism. I'd be very wary of Franken watches. If you're buying online and you see something described as refurbished, I'd think twice about a purchase and be vigilant of where the seller is listing from, as without wanting to name and shame, some countries have a subculture of MacGyvering together watches with a big brand name on the dial but no other original parts. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing for more content like this in future.